Hey everyone, this is Adam Law with a new video for Wanderings. Today's video is called Dahmer. Most of you probably are finished with Dahmer right now. It's been the #1 show in the US and Canada for a number of weeks, 10 episodes on Netflix. And it's been a riveting show. Very disturbing, very dark. Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial murderer who killed 17 victims and even ate them. Now, the show, I don't want to necessarily say is totally authoritative. I'm sure they did do their research. This video is going to be based around the show, not other videos, interviews, books, etc., which I'm sure there is tons of stuff out there. But basically, on what we can learn about ourselves, psychology, life from the show itself, Dahmer. I'm not actually going to put any clips in here for copyright purposes. I'm just going to talk about here 5 major ideas for personal and spiritual growth, what we can learn about life, parenting, justice, etc. from Dahmer, how it affected me. There's one thing I want to make clear from the outset, which is that Jeffrey Dahmer did horrible things. He murdered people. This was extremely evident yesterday when I was at a friend's house and I mentioned Dahmer, and my friend said to me, "Dahmer ate my roommate's brother." It was absolutely shocking. And it just made me realize when I make my video here that we're talking about people's lives. That itself is actually one of the themes of the show, is trying to personalize and show people not just as victims or numbers, but as individual people with hopes, with dreams. They had whole lives ahead of them, and there were many, many, many people who were affected. They also showed them how Dahmer is viewed by a hero by some in the show. Nevertheless, what we're here to do is to learn. What can we learn from it? Because you might say, Adam, why are you making something about a show? Because all good shows, all good books, all good movies are about the human condition. What can we learn? How does this touch us? How does this make us feel? And Dahmer certainly is no exception to that. When it's a well-made movie, a well-made show, a well-made book, you're going to feel something strong. So anyway, today, without further ado, I want to talk about the 5 things you can learn about yourself from the Dahmer show. I want to mention as well is please subscribe and like to my channel. I put a lot of time into this to support me. And as well as I'm available for psychotherapy, coaching, etc. This is what I do. So the first thing I want to mention in the Dahmer show is called attachment and individuation. Basically, we're trying to figure out here what went wrong with Dahmer. And that's one of the major themes of the show. And maybe we'll discuss it later, but one of the takeaways is you really can't ever know for sure. We just don't know enough about people, about their brains. But we can start looking into some of the reasons why maybe Dahmer had some of the problems that he had. He did have individual choice to make, that he chose to do these evil things to some way. Though I think that's also another theme of the show, about whether he was compelled, about whether a person has free will to do some of these things. Nevertheless, we need to look at the roots of why Dahmer did what he did. The first thing I'd like to talk about is called attachment and individuation. Now, everybody knows when you see somebody who's suffering, who's going through some difficulty in their life, people, if they're smart, they're wise, they say, what happened in this person's past? Why is this person like this way? So many theories, many people believe that the actual very most basic primal elements in a person's development is when they are born. When a person's born, they're helpless. They're just a little baby. They're depending on their mother for everything, for their life, for their sustenance, for safety. And as a child gets older, the child starts to individuate, right? The child is inside the womb, completely encased in the bliss of the oneness with their mother. And then it goes out and it's still somewhat in that environment. But as a child grows to adulthood, starting way back at the way beginning, when they're a baby, it's this process of individuation. And oftentimes we see, Freud says this, a lot of people say this afterwards, that when somebody doesn't have a healthy childhood, and even way back to the very beginning of their connection to their mother and the safety of the environment around them, that can have a tremendous impact on how the person ends up. We see this idea of the kidults, people who don't grow up, guys who are still obsessed with their mother and still have this very close relationship with their mother, women who don't move beyond the way they feel about themselves based on their mother, their father, etc. So the way that the show presented Jeffrey Dahmer was that he had a very unstable mothering. It's clear throughout the whole show that the mother was very inadequate as a mother. Now, it does give some nuance to that later in the show by talking about postpartum depression and that she learns that about herself. And to her degree, she worked on herself. But even at the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's life, when he's caught and he's in jail, you can see she's a very absent mother. And, we'll talk about the father later in a minute. But since she had postpartum depression, I think the message that it's giving us is that that Jeffrey Dahmer had a very unstable babyhood, that he didn't properly attach. The environment that we're in when we're a baby has a tremendous impact on how we view the world, right? We went from the bliss of being inside the womb to hopefully being a blissful existence as a baby. But what if things aren't there? What if the mother can't connect to the baby? What if the mother abandons the baby? What if it's not only just the mother's fault? What if outside of that, there's a very unstable environment? The mom and dad are fighting and screaming all the time. They're worried about money, or there's a war going on, or something like that. All these contribute to a sense of these primal emotions when the baby is forming, to him to have some sort of trauma. The child doesn't attach to the parent properly, and therefore their whole life they have problems with attachment and bonding. And also when it comes time to individuate, to become their own separate person, they also have struggles with their ability to individuate and become their own self-conscious, independent human being. So clearly we see here that Dahmer had an unstable family background. Clearly she's portrayed as not a sympathetic character in the show. The father we'll get to in a little bit. So I want to say that number one is that we can learn a lot about who somebody is by how safe their mothering was, how much they were able to attach, and also the environment around the mother, right? Even there's some theories that say even in the womb of the baby is very able to pick up, feelings, the woman's scared, the emotions, the adrenaline, that can have a strong effect on things. Section number 2, which is a continuation of that, is parenting. Parenting, or lack of it, is clearly one of the strongest elements in a child's life. We see that Dahmer's parents do not get along. It's not a stable living environment. The mother seems to be mentally ill. The father chastises her, attacks her, calls her inadequate, etc. He doesn't have a great childhood. Jeffrey doesn't. He's an intelligent kid. Doesn't seem that he's mentally ill, but there's a lot of sense, particularly in the show as he gets older, that he's very lonely, that he feels alienated. He doesn't fit in with other people. He has a very low self-worth, which leads to him drinking. And the alcoholism now enables his true feelings to come out. If you're ever around an addict, alcoholic, you see that oftentimes the only emotions really come out where the real feelings of who they are, and that's usually not positive, come out when they're drinking. Jeffrey was a very alone, alienated, and lonely boy. His father, for his own part, was a decent father. I think that's one of the things that's a takeaway from the show, at least to me. I think some women might find that triggering for me to say that, but I think that you can't really say that, at least if Jeffrey Dahmer's father was at fault, he didn't mean to be there. He tried to be there. He tried to encourage Jeffrey. He tried to be there for Jeffrey from the beginning to the end with some faults. He was a faulty person. He made some mistakes. He wasn't flawless, like when he left. And later on, he feels a lot of guilt and shame after everything happens for abandoning Jeffrey for a short period of time. Jeffrey was actually left alone when he was a teenager for a number of months. His mother ran off, etc. But generally, Jeffrey's father seems like a pretty decent guy. And even in the worst of the worst, he doesn't abandon him. He stands by him and tries to help him at the end without trying to absolve responsibility. Sometimes with some parents who aren't so good, if they're living vicariously through the child, they don't believe their child's at fault. And you see that eventually, Jeffrey's father does accept the fact that who Jeffrey is, and he also takes some personal responsibility for it. That may be true or not, whether it was the father's fault, but either one way or another, you can't really fault the father completely, other than the fact that he wasn't always around. And that itself is an interesting question itself. Nowadays, we tend to see that fathers are supposed to be around. When there's a divorce, when there's a breakup, fathers are usually around. But in the old days, it really wasn't like that. Back then, it was much more common for the father to be really the sole breadwinner or the main breadwinner. And he was oftentimes busy and running around. In the old school traditional order of how the family ran, the father oftentimes was busy and gone. But when he was around, he was a wonderful figure who was close and cared about the kids. I have to do some research on this, but it does seem to be that, at least in the old order of thinking, that if a father wasn't around that much, it wasn't that important. But when he is around, how he acted is extremely important. Meaning is you didn't need to get a lot of your father at quantity, but you needed to get quality time. So it's apparent to me that Jeffrey's father had both quality and quantity. The problem was that Jeffrey's father didn't really have a good relationship with the mother and didn't have enough compassion for the mother's problems to try to keep the family together. The mother, we're not absolving her of any crime. She clearly was a very inadequate mother. But the father didn't try hard enough to keep the family stable. Later on, he met a wife who was more stable. We see that. But I personally felt touched by the portrayal of Jeffrey Dahmer's father, that he was a caring person. And I also think it's particularly brave of the producers of the show to even show this, because nowadays it's very common that men are always shown as the bad guys or stupid or bumbling, like Homer Simpson, as fathers, and the mothers are the ones, the true bedrock of the family. But the show is brave enough to admit the truth here that really you can't say that in this case. You can't say that Jeffrey's mother was a good mother, and you can't say Jeffrey's father was a bad father. You can't say that. They're obviously very flawed people. I don't think they're responsible for what Dahmer did, but you see here clearly that they are pointing their finger at Jeffrey's mother as for being very inadequate, and they're trying to show a sympathetic part. They're trying to show a sympathetic figure in Dahmer's father. Ideally, of course, children need both parents. They absolutely need both parents. And we've gone so far from the ideal of the way that our bodies biologically are built for there to be a male and a female in the household raising a child. And except in the most extreme circumstances, that's the way it should be, right? We're not saying divorce is totally impossible, but it should be an absolute last resort. For the sake of the family and the continuation of the family and the mental health of everyone involved, having a stable family unit is the most important thing. It's interesting, though, because statistics have shown that if there's a single parent, oftentimes after the initial stage of the child being, a nursling, that as a child gets older, it tends to be, the statistics show that a single father does a better job at raising a healthy child than a single mother. This isn't a jab at single mothers, but this is just a statistic. And even the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, says the same thing, that in a case of a custody battle, the father should be awarded custody at age 8. When the child gets older, it's more important for the stability of the child for the father to be there. Ideally, of course, a two-parent household, but we see that the father does have a very primal role in raising the child. Now, of course, in the show, you could argue the opposite in this particular example, because you see really his only real parent is the father, and Jeffrey still ends up the way he is. But again, the point here is not to point fingers at anybody and say anyone's fault. Clearly, it was Dahmer's fault. This is what happened. But we're trying to figure out a little bit about how the dynamics of the family, the absenteeism of the family, of how they were involved in the family may have affected his psychology. And that leads to point number 3, and that is the loneliness of Jeffrey Dahmer. A major theme of trying to figure out who Jeffrey is shown by the fact that he's a very lonely person. And when he gets drunk, he gets over his inhibitions. Jeffrey's homosexual. He likes the presence of young men. And it's not just sex, but he actually wants to be close to other men. You see some very disturbing scenes with like him and the mannequin, stealing a mannequin, hugging the mannequin. But you see over and over again, the reason why Jeffrey kills is because he's so low in self-esteem, he thinks he's so unlovable, that he feels the only way to keep somebody around is by murdering them. And that's also why he eats them and why he buries them close to the house. It's very sick, very gruesome. But to understand that he was an abandoned, lonely person who didn't have the love. It's very interesting because there's this big video going around now about, Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson, crying and defending the incel community, right? And incels is like the biggest bad word. To be a young, lonely, sexless young man is the biggest evil you can be nowadays. But Rollo Tomasi said something very interesting about this. He said, there's no such thing as an incel. What did he mean? Of course there are. He said, any person can go out and have sex. They can go to a prostitute or whatever. What these young men are desiring is intimacy with females, closeness, emotionalness, to feel loved. They probably weren't loved or accepted by their parents, by their peers, and therefore this sort of neurosis, this psychosis, develops and it gets very bad in their 20s. So incel, involuntary celibate, isn't the right word, because no one is involuntarily celibate. Any person could have sexual intercourse. But what these sad, lonely men are just lonely, sad men. And yeah, you see extreme examples like Jeffrey Dahmer, or that guy here in Toronto who ran over a bunch of people. Sick people. But it's that when their sickness is mixed with this loneliness. And I think we can learn a lot about the human condition, that people need people, that we're not islands, that the abandonment, the alienation that Jeffrey felt from his parents and from his peers led him to ultimately trying to find the only way he could keep people around in his sick, twisted way, which was to kill them and ultimately even eat them. Point number 4. As a psychotherapist and chaplain, I've learned over and over again in my healing of others that suffering is the universal human component, and that I could help any person if we're able to open ourselves up, to be vulnerable to one another, to talk about why we're hurting. And I think this is shown really well in the show, giving us empathy for the disadvantaged. The show is about Dahmer, but there's other factors in the show between the homosexual community and the Black community that, when it comes down to it, these communities don't get the same amount of support, and there's a higher risk of death, suicide, murder, crime in these communities because they are disadvantaged communities. That's why clearly the hero of the series is Glenda, who, despite all the suffering, despite all the things that being pushed down she has, the disadvantages she has in her life being a single mom, that she goes out there and she's the heroine of the story. She doesn't give up, and she goes out and fights and fights and fights. For an advantaged person, a middle class or upper middle class white person, they wouldn't have had to worry about this. This whole situation would have been over a long time ago. They would have listened to Glenda in the first place. But she just shows an example of how someone can overcome their adversity. And when we see the suffering of the other, when we see that these communities, despite the fact that they're championed nowadays, still have not only historically been oppressed, but still in those communities themselves, they're not going to get the same amount of services, police protection. They're not going to be listened to. We can see how the terrible tragedy developed. There was definitely a racial element to it. Not only in Dahmer's killings, who he chose, the disadvantaged, the homosexuals, the people of color, but also in how the police reacted to such things. Really, when we speak to people, when we spend time with people, it opens up our heart and our mind to realize the humanity in others despite the differences. You know, as a Jewish person, when I lived in Israel, speaking to Palestinians opened my mind to seeing their suffering and the things they're going through. I don't have to be part of somebody's cause. It's the same thing with Black Lives Matters. I don't have to be part of the Black Lives Matters cause to identify and feel bad for the historical suffering and injustice that Black people have suffered in the West, right? So we need to see people, to communicate, to have conversations with people. I think this is one of the biggest problems going on in the West today, is this bifurcation between the left and the right and the woke and the conservative. We need to be out of conversations. Don't assume that we know everything. We're only looking from our experiences. We have to look into other people's experiences. And that's why I feel really blessed to do the work that I do, because it enables me to meet all sorts of people that maybe I would normally judge. But then when you hear their stories, you have nothing but compassion for them. And the show Dahmer does a great job of that. I particularly like the episode devoted to Tony, Black homosexual, and his family. He was just such a lovable character. You just loved Tony. And when he was murdered, it really showed the personal side of the horribleness of who Dahmer was and what happened here. Because again, it's very easy, millions of people were killed in the Holocaust. 50 people were shot in a school shooting, 17 people murdered by Dahmer. But when you hear one story, I cried, honestly, watching Tony's story. He was such a lovable person over all the problems, being deaf, being gay, growing up in a disadvantaged household, all the things he went through, and that he was just such a good, sweet person. And then when he was killed, I felt like it was the biggest tragedy of the whole show. So kudos to the creators of Dahmer, that they were able to show the human side, both in the heroes, Glenda, and the sweetness of the victim of people like Tony and the other characters who were horribly murdered in the show. My last point I want to talk about is forgiveness / vengeance. Particularly towards the end of the show, you see this with his court cases and the way that he's affected. Some of the families have grace and basically seem to forgive. Others want his death and his vengeance. Nothing shows us stronger than the juxtaposition in the last episode between Jeffrey Dahmer becoming baptized and Jeffrey Dahmer being killed by the inmate who feels he's God's agent of justice on him. I personally have a problem with spiritual systems which say all you have to do is become saved, all you have to do is become baptized. Because a person needs to live their life with contrition. You don't see that Jeffrey Dahmer has a lot of contrition for what he did, just except for the one little token statement he makes in court, probably to get himself off in court. You don't see that. You see he gets one with God, he gets right with God, but yet he doesn't seem to get right with the people that he hurt. And I think it's a real problem. You know, I have to say, I don't agree with any spiritual creed which makes a person change who they are via God, but not via people, right? God doesn't need us to get closer to God. God needs us to get closer to people, right? God's infinite. God's one. God's awesome. God wants us to be better to other people. And it's quite disturbing when you see Jeffrey Dahmer becomes baptized at the end of the show. And it actually feels satisfying to see the vengeance that's brought upon Dahmer as is beaten to death by another inmate. And you realize this is really ultimately what he deserves. Truth is, the pain and suffering he caused to others there's no way in all of Dahmer's lifetimes, if he had 17 lifetimes, could that be paid back for. But nevertheless, some things only death can atone for. So I hope today you enjoyed 5 points we can learn about Dahmer, about the human condition, about individuation, parenting, forgiveness, atonement, and why Dahmer maybe did what he did. I think walking away, we can understand that this is a show. It's sensationalized, but it does give a little glimpse into the human condition. It does let us understand a little bit about why maybe Dahmer did these things, and at least what we can learn about ourselves. How to be better people, more caring for the disadvantaged, being better parents, being better spouses, and to look out for the people around us who are lonely and alienated in our communities, right? No one can say any of these are the cause for what Dahmer doing what he did. He has to take responsibility in this world, the next world, or whatever for what he did. Nevertheless, even in the biggest tragedies, especially in the biggest tragedies, we can learn so much about ourselves and how to be better people. Thank you very much. This is Adam Law from Wanderings. Have a great day. Please subscribe and like. And I'm always available for coaching and psychotherapy. Take care. Bye-bye.